Hi, nice to see you all. I hope you're enjoying the conference. It's been really awesome so far, in my opinion. I might be biased. Okay, this is session two, and I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator from the University of Arizona, Tucson. This is Jonathan Henao Munoz. Sí, Henao Munoz. Jonathan Henao. You know what? I'm sorry, Jonathan. Give me one more chance. This is Jonathan Henao Munoz.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Ben. No worries. H in Spanish is silent, so we will be fine with that. So, as Ben mentioned, I'm Jonathan Henao Munoz. I'm an assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona, and today I will be moderating the session 2 of this wonderful conference. So, just a couple of reminders, we will have 4 papers presentations, 15 minutes each, and at the end of all presentations, we will have the question session. You may want to keep your questions by the end, or you can add them in the chat section of the Zoom talk we have. So let's start with our first presentation today for the session 2, Achieving Gender Equity Through the Language Curriculum, from Rana, Raddawi, Franziska B. Lee, Ragy, Ibrahim, Mikhaeel, from the Northwestern University.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Good afternoon from Chicago, everyone. I'm Rana Raddawi, Associate Professor of Instructions at the MENA Languages Program at Northwestern. I teach Arabic and translation, and my pronouns are she and her. Before we start our presentation, I would like to thank really from the heart the organizers of this very timely, significant, and great conference. I'll be happy to talk briefly to you today about our project. Let me share my screen, along with my 2 colleagues from Northwestern, Professor Franziska Liz and Ragy Mikhaeel. So first of all, we will give a brief introduction about our project, and then we will talk about the 2 major achievements of our team in the past year. So one would be the surveys that we conducted at Northwestern for instructors, language instructors, and another survey for students. The other achievement is the paper we are about to publish. It's under review by Routledge that also relates to the same subject. So first of all, our project, Gender Equity Through the Language Curricula, is funded by the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern. It's a 2-year project. We are now in the 2nd year of the project, and I'm leading the project, and I have with me on board 11 Northwestern faculty from different language departments, such as Arabic, German, Spanish, Chinese, Polish, French, and also 2 faculty members from other disciplines, one from gender and sexuality studies and linguistics, and the other faculty member is from computer science and learning sciences. Before I talk about the objective of the project, I'd like to tell you how this actually idea of gender equity in the language curriculum came to exist. As you know, gender equality is one of the UN Sustainable Sustainable Development Goals. And you know that gender equality, gender equity has been a very important issue for all human rights activists, feminists in the last 100 years. And a lot has been done in the field. However, the UNDP report recently states a huge gap, still a huge gap, in terms of gender equity between men and women, men and non-binary, third gender, other gender. So this led us to think about what we teach actually in our classes. And since language is a means of communication, you know, we thought that maybe something should be done, because what we teach at the end of the day is who we are. I mean, education shapes the personality and the attitude of the learner in real life. So we thought that maybe thinking about our curriculum and trying to change something to achieve gender equity in our classes would probably lead to social agents of change in real life who are our learners. So the objective of our research is to investigate the role of language and gender in language curricula, address the question of whether language curricula contribute to the reinforcement of stereotypes and the perpetuation of gender discrimination. Research has shown actually that language textbooks in general tend to reinforce gender role stereotypes and gender discrimination. So they tell us that men generally are dominant in the content and the language, and they are portrayed in general as in leadership positions such as managers, pilots, doctors, whereas women are less visible, especially in pictures, and are presented as caregivers, nurses, and housewives. As to the non-binary, other gender, third gender, the LGBTQ community, they are almost absent in these language textbooks. For more conservative languages, it's heavier. For less conservative languages, lighter, but they are still absent, okay, in terms of language and content. So what are the areas of research that we're looking at? The curriculum, what we teach, the material, the classroom environment, how we interact, are we inclusive in our classroom interaction and our teaching practices? And then the pedagogical methods. So the ultimate goal is to create valuable resources, supplementary teaching materials if needed, interactive classroom practices, pedagogical approaches that would include community connections, which will empower our instructors to approach the ongoing social phenomenon of social justice and gender equity with more critical thinking approach, taking into consideration the different cultures of the target languages and have a systemic intervention. So now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Professor Mikhaeel, to talk about the content, little bit, the content of the paper we are about to publish. Thank you.
It goes without saying that the gender roles and gender identities are an integral part of the target language and culture. And we have here in Arabic a culture and a language that recognizes only cisgender, which makes the situation difficult. And I mean, looking for material online for that research, we found, for example, that queers in Morocco had to develop a code that's only understood by their community to avoid whether chased by national security or stigma and violence by the public. We're still talking about a language within a conservative society. This adds a burden looking for material either for research or for developing teaching material focused on gender in Arabic. Next slide, please. So introducing gender issues and gender identity and expressions can be difficult. We know that Arabic, for example, is an exclusively binary language. It is not, and gender is not a one-dimensional entity. It exists in a dimension of language, in a dimension of culture, and so on. And Arabic, the problem is that Arabic doesn't provide gender fluid pronouns. We have a problem with the pronouns. Some instructors and even students would feel uncomfortable discussing a gender issue in class. These are all some of the difficulties that we may encounter. I'd like to read one of the students, sending his own cry through Reddit website that accommodates such kind of statements. He says, in learning Arabic, he or she, I'm learning Arabic, but my teacher says I need to pick a binary gender because there is no gender neutral pronouns in Arabic. I know she speaks fluent Arabic, but like maybe hopefully there are some anyways. Or is one gender generally considered more neutral or default than the other? What do I do with actually 11 O's in his do? I can't drop the class now and Arabic looks so pretty. Send help, please. I'm struggling here. So this is simply an example that shows that our students, including binary, non-binary, and gender fluid, who are learning about a new language and culture, are nowadays interested in a variety of issues related to gender. It is therefore important that we make every effort to adapt or change the curriculum and teaching material. And this is why we started this research. However, research unfortunately tells us that especially language textbooks fall short of these expectations. I will give the floor, due to shortage of time, to Dr. Liz to talk about the surveys and their results of our research. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Dr. Liz, you're
Yes.
muted.
I got it. I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Rana and Ragy, for doing the introduction and for giving us some background. And thank you for working with the group on this project. I'm going to give you some points of the online surveys we did, just to show you what some of the key findings were in our survey. And we hope that you get to see our webpage on more of the details. So the surveys were done in the spring 2023. It was a group effort, and we developed an instructor survey and a learner survey. And the goal of the survey was to investigate how language instructors and their learners perceive their language teaching material in class, mostly textbooks, but also supplemental material, and their classroom dynamics concerning gender and gender equity. Next slide, please. For the instructor survey, we targeted about 80 instructors of all languages and all levels at Northwestern University, and 27 instructors finished the survey. There were 13 languages represented in the survey. 74% were female, 19% were male. And the interesting part was that most of the instructors who took the survey were seasoned instructors. So 76% of the instructors had more than 7 years of teaching experience. Next slide. The one finding we thought was really interesting, and is probably a reason, the textbook is probably the reason for that, is that the topics covered from the textbooks and in the classes did not match what instructors wanted to teach. So if you see on the left side, what is currently taught, these were the topics that were listed most often. And the LGBTQ community was listed only last, but when you compare it to the right side, topics they would have liked to teach included gender bias in the language, social issues, LGBTQ community. So we somehow, because of the textbooks, because of the material that is available, do not teach what we really would like to do. We also found out that the pedagogical pedagogy and grammar approaches are still the most important criteria for textbook selections for instructors. And if you look at language, equitable gender representation in text, topics, and visuals, is only on the 4th place, and language is even further down. So we still seem to be in a pattern of saying we need to have the grammar, and what is the grammar telling us? Next slide, please. The results suggest, and I'm not going to go into all detail, is that the instructors have a very divergent opinion on gender representation in the textbooks. You can see that 45% agree that their readings, pictures, and video films are well distributed or balanced, but you also have 25% that are not sure and don't know exactly what to look for. Next slide. And the interesting part to us was that despite the fact that language textbooks didn't seem to give the instructors what they needed in the classroom, they still felt that what they did in the classroom in terms of the pedagogy and approaching the students, that they did a great job in balancing the classroom, and they felt well prepared to talk about gender and gender issues. And the last point I want to make is, even so we had seasoned instructors, most instructors said that they would like to have and would additional training on promoting gender and gender equity in the future, and have workshops and group training that would allow them to do a better outreach to the students. I'm going to give you a few points on the learner survey. We had 109 learners who finished the survey. Again, 13 languages represented, about half were female, 39 males. And 90% of them were undergraduates, and 76% of them were speaking English. And the first thing we realized is that we have the same problems. Students found the same problems as with instructors, that the topics we teach were not the topics they wanted to know about and to learn about and to discuss in class. And even so, we seem to have good textbooks. There were still 20% of learners who found very specific issues with gender equity in the classroom material they used. And I listed a few here that you can sort of have a quick look. And the next one. Again, 98% of learners thought that despite the textbook, their classroom was very balanced. And 70% of the learners thought that their instructor was generally well equipped to deal with issues of gender equity in the classroom. The interesting fact to us was also that 25% had no opportunity to observe this, which meant they never really had thought about it.
Okay, thank you, Franziska. So to conclude, because of time restrictions, these were our recommendations in the paper. First of all, to hire expert in gender inclusivity when writing a textbook, and encourage female and non-binary authorship and not just male. The other recommendation is to have, based on the findings of the surveys, is to have pre-service and in-service training for teachers, including untethered professional development opportunities, where we would have a faculty-centered workshop, faculty-centered approach. Outside of classroom, faculty members would come together, teachers, and share their experiences in the classroom. The other recommendation is to connect students with target language communities. We take our students to communities in the target language that are marginalized, that are minorities, to also narrate their experiences, including LGBTQ community, and how they live actually their lives within the target culture. Also create supplementary teaching material, as I said, that's to cover any gender inclusivity gaps in the curriculum or the actual textbook that we teach. Conduct further research on inclusive language, especially in gendered languages like Arabic and Hebrew. We need more research to see how we can be more inclusive, gender inclusive in our teaching. And last but not least, encourage use of neutral language in the meantime. Our colleagues talked about that as much as we can, and I know that the United Nations has been doing a good job in, for example, encouraging their interpreters, their staff, to use neutral language in their daily lives. I thank you very much, and we open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Please, everybody, leave the comments, questions you have in the chat, and we will address them later at the end of the rest of the presentations. So for the second presentation we have today, we have personal pronouns in school, a question of identity, inclusion, and icebergs, from Karin Miles from Södertörn University. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just try to share my screen first. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very excited to take part of everything in the world right now. So professor in Swedish, and I teach Swedish at a university just outside Stockholm. And I have been very invested in the discussion on gender fair language in Sweden for almost 20 years, and concerning pronoun choice in Swedish schools and how teachers and schools are handling this. So young transgender individuals and getting the people around them to use their preferred pronouns. And in my study, I conducted surveys and interviews to examine just how schools deal with students' choice of pronouns. I'm unstable right now. So the result of my research indicate that teachers often consider the student's choice of pronouns a natural part of inclusive approach, that they should use the pronoun that the student selects. However, my study also show that school culture and administrative conditions can create obstacles for young transgender individuals to explore and develop their identity on an equal footing with their peers. So first, some background. The Swedish pronoun system traditionally has two gendered pronouns that corresponds to English she and he, and at least 3 new non-binary corresponding to singular they. And the importance of respecting transgender people's choice of pronouns is emphasized in many guidelines for inclusive treatment in Sweden. The Swedish Language Council, for example, states that if someone wants to be referred to as they, it should be respected, just as it should be respected if someone wants to be referred to as he or she. And earlier research also shows that there is a growing interest in LGBT-friendly pedagogy in Sweden and suggests the value of respecting the pronoun choice of trans children and youth. And there is evidence that show that the use of pronouns is an important part of the expression of identity. But research also shows that transgender students experience a lot of problems, administrative problems. This might include getting their name and pronouns registered in a way that they will be used, for example, in hospitals and in educational settings. And trans students must deal with a lot of ignorance, resistance, and questioning. And identity it's partly relational, of course. I become something in relation to you. And part of this is done by language. We speak and write each other into being. Althusser has coined the term interpellation, with which he meant that society and its institutions have the power to call or hail individuals, shaping their identities and making them recognize themselves as part of certain social roles and structures. But also, sociologists such as Irving Goffman, for example, and Herbert Mead have described how we come into being in the eyes of others, how the I is dependent on a you, to develop a sense of self. So according to this understanding of identity, personal third-person pronoun are the performance of gender, to speak with Butler, that we do not control ourselves. This is a performance that others must do for us. Our peers, our partners, our teachers, our parents must use the third-person pronoun that corresponds to our gender. So I like to use the metaphor of the paper doll to emphasize the fact that some aspects of our identity are not completely of our own making. Just like the child decides what clothes to put on the paper doll, other people take part in making us into the persons we are by how they perceive us, how they treat us, what pronouns they use when talking about us. So other theoretical concepts that interest me are, among others, structural ambivalence, which describes a situation where societal structures or institutions simultaneously support and undermine certain values, beliefs, identities, resulting in conflicting attitudes and behaviors. And ally work, which is a concept that, as you might know, of course, originally referred to members of the dominant groups, men, whites, and heterosexuals, engaging in battling sexism, racism, heterosexism. But here I refer to the work of apparent cisnormative teachers advocating on issues related to trans students. And last but not least, school-based social capital, which is based on the economy, the reputation, the brand of the school, the students' social backgrounds, the teachers' ethos, etc. So I set out to find out how schools in Sweden and teachers are dealing with students' choice of pronouns. First, I sent out an electronic survey with two aims. I wanted to find out if teachers met students wanting to change pronouns and their attitudes towards this and how they handled it. And did the schools regulate this in any way? Were there any general guidelines? I collected roughly 200 answers from most larger cities, a majority from Stockholm. So I also used the survey to recruit teachers that were willing to talk to me, so I could get a sort of a deeper understanding. And I held 9 interviews. They were on site if possible, and digital if not. And so the result that I wanted to share with you is my survey indicates that this phenomenon do occur, but it's not very common. The bars from the survey here represent how often respondents encountered students who wanted to change pronouns. The highest bar represents those who have never experienced this. And there's a descending scale with barely 40 people saying they have encountered it occasionally, and only 9% saying they have encountered it often. So, and how should we then assess this? One important aspect to identify here is to identify sources of error, of course. It's more likely that teachers who do meet this phenomenon will be filling out my survey, of course, than those who don't. So the bars on the left are probably a bit too low and should be even higher. And the bars at the right too high and should be even lower. But one thing is certain though, this do occur in Swedish schools today. Swedish trans youth do sometimes ask teachers to use a specific pronoun of the youth choice. But how are the teachers handling this then? Many of my informants are telling me that this is a non-issue. No one is opposed to this, they say. You just take a mental note and you try to use the right name and the new pronoun. It's part of being a good teacher, many of them say. It's part of making every student feel included in the group, part of meeting every student as an individual, so on and so forth. But this issue do take some work, some ally work. And this is mainly talked about among those teachers who have met quite a few trans youth, because meeting actual trans youth who wants to change to another pronoun or name, it does take a bit of work. This work includes learning the new pronoun, being open to making mistakes and correcting them, making notes to substitute or temp teachers who come in a day or two, and so forth. And you see here a quote from a teacher who takes this ally work very seriously. They say, "This is kind of my passion, you know. I try to stay updated on these things. As someone interested in language, you see, so for me, it becomes quite natural. I think that if I had a student, I would probably take on the captain's hat, so to speak." And there are some challenges I want to describe them as sort of under the surface. So much is going on under the surface that I labeled them icebergs. Firstly, a big lack of guidelines, how to handle problems that may arise when it comes to names on the class list, the mail address, communication with parents, temp teachers, and only 3% of the participants in the survey said there were guidelines on how to deal with these issues. So, second iceberg. In certain schools, there's a big silence when it comes to this. Or as one of my interviewees put it, there are transgender students at my school, but it's not a topic of conversation, nothing we talk about. And what makes things worse is that there are teachers who disregard the students' choices, as one puts it. It can also sometimes be perceived that students change pronouns in a routine manner and that there are more important issues to work on. And third, but not least, there seems to be big differences between schools, school cultures. Some schools are more LGBT friendly, while others are less so. And here's a quote from a teacher who works in a school perceived to not being LGBT friendly. And they say, if you identify as non-binary, then you do not go to this school. They check social media, they attend open houses, they talk to each other, they know which schools are relevant. So to conclude, my survey identified 3 big challenges when it comes to pronoun choice in schools. The lack of routines, making teachers having to handle administrative problems and obstacles of implementing new pronouns. 2, schools uninterested in making the classroom or corridors a safe space for trans people. And 3, kids choosing school not after academic interest or career ambitions, but because of their gender identity. And that, I think, is very concerning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. As a reminder, everybody, please check the chat for the questions you will drop there, and also for the timing. We just have another presentation, the tier 1, Reimagined Stories, Creating Gender-Inclusive Student Craft Narratives from Nooshan Ashtari from the University of Arizona. Here I am, University of Southern California. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So great to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, everyone. So great to see you all. My name is Nooshan Ashtari, and I teach applied linguistics, TESOL, and anything to do with second language acquisition in general at USC, and I'm also in other places as well. But my title of this presentation is Reimagined Stories, Creating Gender-Inclusive Student-Crafted Narratives. And I really like this scene from Hercules, with Hercules and Megara talking about him trying to save Megara from this monster, and she refuses, and he says, but aren't you a damsel in distress? And she says, I'm a damsel, I'm in distress, I can handle this. Have a nice day. And she wants him to go away, which is kind of the story that we've been told throughout human history over and over again, of this damsel in distress and all these binary gender and gender roles. However, when it comes to languages, the many different research studies have shown that we are born with, not just languages, but in general, we are born with biological sex. We learn to perform gender. Or even the first part, I think we argue about that as well, that what does this biological sex in and of itself mean? And when it comes to performance of gender, all of these different sides of the spectrum that a lot of times get ignored when it comes to the way that we are like in the society and how we're perceived and how we're supposed to act in certain ways. even when it comes to binary sexes, it seems like we learn these from very, very, very early on in our lives, in our childhood. So they did a study that they kind of went through elementary schools, and even at 7-year-old, 6-year-old elementary school age, many of the elementary schoolers were saying that being a boy is better because some of the reasons that they gave, it's much easier to do things than being a girl. You get to do much better things as boys. It's boring being a girl. However, when it comes to the performance of gender, they fluctuated all the time, depending on different situations, the reactions of others, and any other cultural and familial backgrounds that they had. So the mindset versus the performance is not necessarily a match. Also, even 100 years ago, and I can't even imagine how it has been before that, but even 100 years ago, Virginia Woolf was saying that a lot of the stories that we have created as humans and a lot of the, different areas of media and everything that we put out there for the world is also not very gender and gender spectrum friendly. For instance, when it comes to women, a lot of times the storylines are extremely simple, and they're usually mothers or daughters or in relation to other men in their lives. And as she was saying, that's how small a part of a woman's life is that is not weird. It's just one role among the many, many, many other things that we do throughout the life. Also, when it comes to media and representation in media, both in fiction and nonfiction, it's usually the same, like very, very small roles for women, let alone all the other parts of the spectrum of gender performance and sex. So Bechdel test, as many of you know, is a measure of the representation of women in fiction that was developed by Alison Bechdel, and it has 3 criteria. So there must be at least 2 named female characters, which I thought was very interesting too, because many of the characters are not even named. Like you don't never learn their names. You never learn about them as a person. They must talk to each other about something other than a man. And here are some results of the analysis of some of the films that have been put out there. And a lot of these are even in the Western world, which is supposed to be more progressive in these regards. So Gina Davis, Institute on Gender in Media, they went through 120 films, and they found that only 31% of named characters were female, 23% had a female protagonist or co-protagonist, 7%, only 7% of directors were women. And in 2016, they did another analysis of screenplays of 2005 films. And they found out 82% of the films, men had the 2 top speaking roles, and women only had 22% of dialogue throughout the film. And this is just a binary male-female, let alone all the other parts of the gender spectrum. I wrote this paper, the tomboy hypothesis, actually based on my own story and my own case, so gender language use and the output filter. And the tomboy hypothesis is based on my own experience. So I probably, looking at me, you don't think that I did actually live as my brother most of my teenage years. So when I was around 11, 12, and my brother was around 14, he moved to the US. I was born and raised in Iran, Tehran, and did not move to the US until after my bachelor's for my master's and PhD. So when my brother was around 14, he moved to the US, and nobody with his ID and identity lived in Iran anymore. So what was really fun, I thought that would be amazing for me to live as him, because I had the ID, I had like everything. I had his clothes, I had his friends, and I lived as him. I shaved my head, of course, with the clothing and everything, and I lived as him. And it was one of the best experiences of my entire life. It was so fun. It was so free. I was perceived differently. even things that I said were taken much more seriously. Even when I said them as a female, people would brush them over, but then I would say them as a boy, and all of a sudden people were paying attention. And that kind of made me think about how we actually acquire multiple variations of our first and subsequent languages. That's why we understand each other. Language is the same. We acquire all these different things that are called gender markers of the way that women speak, the way that men think or speak, and all of those things. However, we do have an output filter. So the input filter, it goes through. That's why we understand each other. That's why even when we're telling stories, jokes, or imitating each other, we can imitate any kind of characters, depending on how comfortable we feel with the other interlocutors that we're speaking with. And that is why the output filter, that is where the output filter comes into place when we represent ourselves, the person that we're supposed to be in front of different groups or even different people or in different societies. We tend to match our output based on the perceptions and expectations of other, as well as how we identify ourselves. And that also it can fluctuate depending on different situations that we are in as well. There's another theory and concept called club membership that was first brought forth by Dr. Frank Smith, who was a psycholinguist, and he talked about it in terms of literacy development, that for a child to become and to be a successful reader and writer, this child has to consider themselves as part of a literacy club, as potential member of the literacy club, and feel welcome and accepted in that club. Also, Professor Stephen Krashen, who is the father of applied linguistics, brought this idea into SLA, or second language acquisition, that for a speaker of a second language to feel like, to acquire the language better and feel comfortable with their second language, they need to consider themselves as potential member of the target language group, and they need to feel welcome and accepted with open arms in that group to be able to have that output filter and affective filter lowered so that they can perform better in that language. Also, when it comes to gender, we also have a similar concept, I assume. I have talked about it in some of my writings and some of my research, that with the gender that we identify with most, we need to feel welcomed and accepted in that group in order to be our authentic self and to be able to perform the best that we can as we're going about life in general, being part of that gender club. So the idea of reimagined stories, creating gender-inclusive, student-crafted narratives, is based on this concept of this spectrum of sex and gender and performance of all of these different aspects of human experience. I think it would be a really good idea to have our students who are in different languages, who are learning different languages and cultures. You can have it in individual, pair, or group work. And the students choose their own story, or they can have their favorite stories or movies from their own language and culture, or those of their target language. And they can be inspired by previous stories, folklore, music, anything that they want, or they can create their own world. And they're reimagining the characters based on other genders on the spectrum. So they can recreate any of these, for example, Hercules and Megara, or any other concepts. It could be any of these wonderful, wonderful stories that we've had in different languages and cultures. As you can see in this picture, we have the Persian and Greek mythology, stories from China and India and Japan, and the Avengers and Justice League and all of these superheroes that the Western world has brought forth. They can do any of these and beyond. So there's no limit. The world is their oyster when it comes to reimagining the stories. But the main part is that They can go with different kinds of genders and gender identities and all of those things so that they can see themselves or people that they interact with in those stories, who a lot of times are not represented in many of these stories. They can also play with any kind of elements of a story and storyline. It could be the conflict, setting, plot, character, theme, style, point of view, tone, any of these things. They can play with them and they can be as creative as possible. And that is when they can use the language, use their second language that they're acquiring in ways that are very, very creative. And they also can include gender inclusive aspects into the stories that they are telling. They can also share their stories within the classroom or outside the borders of the classroom, so they can write, read, or perform their stories. Depending on their age levels, you can have a lot more fun with some of the age levels in terms of the way that they would perform it for each other. For example, when it comes to children, or for example, even for higher education, you can definitely do different kinds of things with the way that they share their stories. And these kinds of stories can be later on combined into a portfolio of stories or into a digital or physical library that the students can go and read each other. And one of the things that the research has shown has been extremely helpful in second language acquisition is reading. And when reading is interesting, what we call optimal input, which is input that is comprehensible, so it's at the level of understanding of the language acquirer, and a little bit higher so that they're getting new information and they're leveling up. And comprehensible, compelling, very interesting, especially when it comes to students reading each other's stories. So that's very interesting because you also know the author or the writer of this story, and you know a little bit about them. So it makes the stories much more interesting, rich and abundant, meaning that there is a lot of context clues. There's also many different kinds of input because each of these students are bringing or creating their own stories, which is extremely helpful in second language acquisition in general. Also, when it comes to Bloom's taxonomy, as you can see, it's remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. We're going from the remember aspect of the stories. They're remembering all these stories that they've been told throughout their lives, or they've seen in movies or on the screen. Now they're understanding it, applying it, analyzing, evaluating, and creating using existing information or the stories that already exist and recreating, reimagining these stories together. So at the end of the day, I really agree with this quote that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. And I think that is really the essence of a lot of these stories and how being able to tell these different aspects of gender inclusive stories is going to help with the diversity and the authenticity of the stories that not only our students, but also the world and the universe can tell to the next generations of all the language acquirers. So with that being said, thank you all so much. Here is a list of selected references if anyone is interested to look at some of the research that was discussed further. And that is pretty much it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Nooshan, for this wonderful, amazing, and super entertaining presentation. I love it. I have questions in a moment, but right now we're gonna focus on the next and our last presentation for the session 2. So we have gender inclusive noun reference and their integration into teaching German as a foreign language with Sabrina Link from the Università degli Studi di Urbino, Carlo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Give me a second. Okay. 1 second. It's loading. Okay, here we go. Okay, thank you very much. So actually my talk will also be a bit about what we already heard from the colleagues from Northwestern, the fact that there's actually not that much teaching material around. So I will talk about gender inclusive noun references and how they can be integrated in generally in language teaching, but in my example, I'm talking about German as a foreign language. So basically, I was wondering, how can I integrate teaching about gender inclusive language in my classes at university? Because as we already previously heard, for many languages and also for German, there's hardly any teaching material available. And so I will briefly present the research questions, then I will introduce the teaching concept that I came up with. I will give a short step-by-step guide. And in order to understand a bit whether the teaching concept actually worked, I did a questionnaire study before and after with my students. So I will also present the 2 questionnaire studies with their design and their results. And then I give a short discussion and outlook. So as mentioned, there is not much teaching material, so I came up with my own ideas. And I was wondering whether this teaching concept that I designed is actually suitable for reaching some learning objectives. The first objective was that the students after the teaching were able to passively interpret and understand gender inclusive noun references in written German. I also wanted to test whether they can then actively use it if they wanted to. I also wanted to see whether the unit helped them to be a bit more sensible about the topic and reflect it more. And lastly, I generally was interested in how they perceive treating the topic in class. So I will only talk about noun references because that's what is kind of the most or the hot topic in German. So I will not talk about pronouns also because that is very tricky in German, but I think we already heard today that sometimes there are quite some restrictions in different languages. So the general conditions, I had students on C1 or C1.2 level at my university in Italy. I planned 5 lessons for the gender inclusive language. Each lesson is 45 minutes. So this is like a whole week of teaching, and we've got 10 weeks per term. And like I said, I did a questionnaire before and after in order to understand a bit more whether the learning objectives have been reached. So I'll start briefly explaining what I did in class. So as an introduction, I did this thought experiment here. It's in German, but you probably know this in English as well. It's a father and a son. They have a car accident. They are brought into different hospitals. When the son is in the operational room, one of the doctors says, "I can't do this operation. This boy is my son. How is this possible?" In German, it's maybe a bit more triggered even because we've got even more like with the cases and everything. But in any case, so the idea is really to make the students think a bit, and most of them naturally actually say, "Oh, well, the son has 2 fathers." And hardly anyone comes up with the idea that one of the doctors could actually be a female doctor. So the idea was just to kind of like trigger a bit of a moment in which the student are like, "Oh yeah, that's true, it could also be a woman," to kind of make them aware how much our thinking can be kind of like I don't know, can just be always focused on what we learned, and that we learned that doctors are often male, which actually is not even true in reality. But so basically it was just really meant to be a wake-up call. Afterwards, we watched a video from Tagesschau, which is a big news provider in Germany. And it was basically an interview with a linguist from a university in Berlin. And he talked about whether gender inclusive language destroys the language. And he talked about language socialization. And so the students, we watched the video and they had to answer a few questions about the content. So this was the introduction. Afterwards, afterwards, we talked a bit about the theoretical background, and first we talked about the written language. I also put a link here, so there's like a homepage that we read together. There's a text written there, and there's like a categorization of gender inclusive noun references. So we read through this and then we categorized them. I don't know how familiar you are with German. For that reason, I've put a few options up here. So we've got two, apart from the generic masculine, we've got two registers. We've got a binary register, which includes only male, female, and we have different forms. As you can see here, we've got a capital I in the middle of the word. We can use the pair form. We can use a participle form, the generic feminine, or a dash. There's other options, but these are just some examples. And there are also some non-binary forms, like the gender star, the gender gap, and the colon. So basically, the idea was also that the students understand, okay, it has a different implication when I use capital I or when I use gender star. And to be fair, a lot of Germans that don't really know anything about gender inclusive language probably wouldn't even know the differences, but I wanted to make sure that my students understand really that there's different implications in different registers. We then also briefly looked at spoken language, just because in German we can actually be gender inclusive when we speak by using the glottal stop. So for instance, if we do this short brief stop between the actual word and the suffix, like for instance, LehrerInnen. That way, this means it's an inclusive form, a non-binary form. So I also wanted to show the students that there's a way to be inclusive in the spoken language. So this was the theoretical part. Then we tried the application. There were some exercises online from a homepage called Deutsch Perfect, and basically the exercises are not really for noun references, but a bit in general. They had like rephrasing exercises, for instance, using infinitive constructions in order to avoid gender. So there were also just some other ideas how you can be gender inclusive. And then I gave the students 3 sentences to rephrase. And the idea was, so they did it in groups, and the idea was to obviously make them try to use gender inclusive language, how they can actually apply it, but also to create a bit of a discussion, because there are a few things in these sentences that are rather tricky. For instance, in the first sentence, we have keinen, which is an article in accusative, a negative article. And this, we can make this article gender neutral, but not completely inclusive in the sense that it can only be binary and not non-binary, or there isn't really good ideas of how to make it non-binary. So another problem, for instance, is the last word here, Ärztehaus, which is like a house with different doctors. This is a compound. So what are we doing with compounds? And German has lots of compound words. Or in the last sentence, we've got aus aller Herren Länder, which is an idiom meaning from everywhere in the world. Herren means men or gentlemen. So what are we doing with expressions like this? So the idea was not only to make them use gender inclusive language and try a bit, what can they do, what can they not do, but also to make them aware that this is an ongoing change, that this is something very relatively new, and that there are forms that we still, or there is no, I mean, there is certain right or wrong. There are certain things that are accepted and not accepted in a way, but still it's something that it's not like grammar. It's not like, okay, you can only do this and you can't do this. So it was also to make them reflect a bit and understand that this is something very flexible and something that's might not work with every word yet, but then we have to be a bit creative and try to find other solutions. And then we did a reflection phase. So we compared the discussion and the options of gender inclusive language in Italian and German. And then I also did a little role play with them. So they basically didn't have to reveal their own opinion on the topic, but they had a role, pro or con, and then they discussed the topic. So this was the teaching unit. And like I said beforehand, I gave them a questionnaire, and I just did a few introduction demographic questions. Then I asked them about previous experience with gender inclusive German, and then I gave them some rephrasing and register assignment tasks. So in my first question, I had 9 participants between 20 and 22 years old. All of them had Italian as a mother tongue. One of them also spoke Albanian, and all of them did German as a degree program. When I asked them whether they have heard of gender inclusive language before, 8 out of 9 said yes. And in the context of German, 6 out of the 9 have heard of it before. And when I asked them in an open question what context it was, they said mainly within the context of German teaching. So it seems like the topic is something they heard of, but it's also something that, especially with German, is a bit more restricted to the classroom. Then I gave them a sentence. Here's a bit of a mixture between Italian and German. A sentence to reformulate, to make more inclusive. And the sentence, we've got two generic masculines. We've got the Lehrer, the teacher, and den Student, the student. And the idea was that they rephrased this without any previous knowledge, so to say. And we can see that most of the students actually focused on the student. So they got, okay, we need to do something with the student here. This is a generic masculine. But not everyone understood that also Lehrer is actually a generic masculine. And we do see that there's already a bit of previous knowledge, that we see the capital I, for instance, we see the dash, so we see different options. So there was some previous knowledge before the teaching unit, but we also see that it wasn't quite clear that there's, for instance, two generic masculines in here. And then I also asked them to assign the registers. And for Lehrende, 7 out of 9 got it right that it can refer to everyone. For the gender gap, LehrerInnen, 4 out of 9 got it right. So there was a bit more confusion. The gender star, 6 out of 9 already got right that this includes everyone, non-binary. And the capital I created most confusion because only 3 out of 9 got it right that it refers to men and women. Most of them therefore interpreted the capital I wrongly. So this was before. Then after the teaching unit, I ran more or less the same questionnaire. Again, introduction, demographic questions. Then I also asked them about how they perceived the topic. And then I gave them the same rephrasing and register assignment tasks as before. So now I had 10 participants. This is also because the students don't have to come to class. It's not obligatory. So we have a bit of a fluctuation sometimes in attendance. So the age distribution always 20 to 22. Mainly Italian native speakers, and they all study German as a language degree program. So when I asked them about their opinion about learning about gender inclusive German, so we see the light green and blue is very and quiet, and then yellow is neutral, and the others weren't really used. So most of them found it very useful to learn about it, and they also found it very interesting, so quite a positive perception. Then I asked them whether they want to use more gender-inclusive language, gender-inclusive German in future, and 6 out of 10 said yes. And when I asked them whether they will be more aware of it, 8 out of 10 said yes. Then I gave them exactly the same sentence as previously and asked them to rephrase it, make it more inclusive. And we can see a few different options here. So in the first sentence, the student understood that Lehrer and Studierende or Student are two generic masculines that need to be made more inclusive if you want to be more inclusive. But then we see that, for instance, with the gender star, in fact, only the plural article die is needed. So the der is not needed, it's actually wrong. And then the verb erklärt here is in singular. So the students, the student didn't understand that it's he or she or they are using a plural noun, but a singular verb. So the grammatical integration didn't really work. Then another example here with the underscore, the gender gap, same thing. The verb is still in singular. It has to be in plural though. And then in the last example, we have, for instance, a mixture between different forms. So there seems to be a bit of a few doubts on how to integrate these forms into a sentence. And then there seems to be also not so a clear cut, like a kind of a mixture between different forms. And it's not clear that, okay, you can't put two things together. It has to be either this or this. When I asked them again about the register, we can see that for the gender star, the capital I, and also the gender gap, the results were better because the orange is the second question I studied, the blue the first one. So we can see that more students got it right, so to say, especially for the capital I that created a lot of confusion in the first questionnaire. In the second questionnaire, 7 out of 10 understood that this is refers to men and women. So this is a binary register. For Lehrende, this is a participle form. It's a bit different because less students got it right in contrast to the first questionnaire study. But as I also mentioned, it's not obligatory for them to attend class. So one explanation is that I didn't explain it well, and that's why they didn't understand it. Another one could be that the student or didn't know what it referred to because he, she, or they weren't in class. So that's another option that unfortunately is a bit tricky when it comes to the results. Okay, so when looking again at the research question, the first research question or the first idea was, is this teaching unit really suitable for a passive interpretation and understanding of gender-inclusive noun references? And I would say it's partly suitable because we just saw that some of the students, even after the teaching unit, interpreted some of the registers wrong. They didn't know what it's binary, non-binary, or who it referred to. Then the active use, again here, only partially suitable, also because I think there needs to be a much bigger focus on grammar, because a lot of students really struggle to integrate the forms into sentences. And I kind of like naively thought, okay, I mean, they're reading examples, we're working on this, they figure it out, they have a high level of German, but that was maybe a bit naive. So it really needs to be explained specifically how to integrate this, what to do with the verb, and so on. The sensibilization and reflection, I would say that is suitable. So all the students seem to have gained a bit of like more awareness towards the topic. And about the perception was positive. The students found it useful, interesting, and also from the debates we had in class, I realized that they really appreciated talking about this. So for the future, the lesson plan or the teaching unit definitely needs to be modified, especially when it comes to the grammatical integration. It would also be nice to integrate more reflexive exercises. And actually, I just recently did something with my students, which they really enjoyed. We used artificial intelligence, and we looked at what different programs, translation programs, do with gender-inclusive language. What are they doing with generic masculine? What are they doing with generic feminine? So this was real fun for the students, and it was also really interesting for me. And obviously, it would be nice to potentially integrate more of this in textbooks. This is something we have already heard previously, but I mean, I work also for a textbook publishing house, and I know that it's really, really hard because they're very timid with integrating this because they want to sell the books for at least 10 years. No one knows whether this is still up to date in 10 years. So I know that this is tricky, but as we already previously saw, and this is also my experience, if it isn't a textbook, it will be taught. And I think it's just a shame that a lot of teachers do not teach it because it's not part of the textbook. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much.